Donald Trump had a phone call with Putin, a lengthy conversation on the same day that the Ramstein meeting took place, in which we heard what the future will be for the United States when it comes to Ukraine. And I have to say, before we even dive into anything, it's not good. It is not good. And so I wanted to go over what Donald Trump talked to Putin about and what Hegseth said during the Ramstein meeting, which now has Europe going. We have a bigger problem. Before we get started, make sure you do subscribe, you turn on notifications, and you give this video a thumbs up. I want to first dive into what Donald Trump said because he put this out on Truth Social. At the time of this recording, it was about 40 minutes ago, but by the time this gets online, it's probably going to be about an hour to an hour and a half. And I do want to read it for you in full, and then we can break it down as we go. He says, I had a lengthy and highly productive phone call with President Vladimir Putin of Russia. We discussed Ukraine, the Middle East, energy, artificial intelligence, the power of the dollar, and various other subjects. We both reflected on the great history of our nations and the fact that we fought so successfully in World War II, remembering that Russia lost tens of millions of people, and we likewise lost so many. And we talked about the strengths of our respective nations and the great benefits that we will someday have in working together. But first, as we both agreed, we want to stop the millions of deaths taking place in the war with Russia and Ukraine. President Putin even used my strong campaign motto of common sense. We both believe very strongly in it. We agreed to work together very closely, including visiting each other's nations. We also agreed to have our respective teams start negotiations immediately, and we'll begin by calling President Zelensky of Ukraine to inform him of the conversation, something which I will be doing right now. There are a lot more things that go down to it, talking about who he's going to have leading the envoys and things and what's going to happen in the future when it comes to talks. But he does continue by saying, millions of people have died in a war that should never have happened if I were president, but it did happen, so it must end. No more lives should be lost. There's a lot of things we can break down with this right here. First being the comparisons between World War II and now, very different scenarios, one in which Russia worked with us, the other one being that Russia invaded a country. So I don't like those comparisons between World War II and what's going on here, because Russia created this. They created this war. They created this situation that put the world into this hole. And I need Donald Trump to understand that's the position. I get that you want this to end. Everyone wants this to end. But Russia is the aggressor in this situation. And as Putin is saying in this through Trump that, they don't want these millions of people to die, it's Putin that started this. There is no scenario here in which Russia is the good person in this scenario. And at no point does Trump even condemn what Putin is doing. He's kind of like whitewashing it. Oh, there's a conflict. It happened. Let's fix it. When reality is, Putin started this. He wanted this. He knew going into this that millions of his people would die and that he would have a massive war which would involve almost every country in the entire world. He went into this knowing this. He's the one who should be coming and saying, let's talk. And remember, this was kind of like a cat and mouse game. We didn't know if Putin was going to reach out to the United States first or if the United States would be reaching out to Putin first, because it's a whole bowing down thing that Putin was trying to avoid. He didn't want to bow down to Ukraine or Zelensky or the United States. He wanted the United States to bow down to him, in which that's what it kind of looks like here. And it makes the United States look very weak. Now, you could argue that point by saying at least there's dialogue going on. But from my point of view, it makes us look weak if we went to Russia to do this. And it also comes at the same time where, we had Mark Fogel come back from Russia in an exchange, which, by the way, we'll be giving them a Russian prisoner. We don't know which one. And we also had Trump pretty much say that we see Putin doing some goodwill, and then later on that day, send 6 ballistic missiles into Ukraine and over 120 plus drones. It's like a big trust thing there that if Putin didn't do things like that, okay, well, yeah, maybe there is some. No. He just proved right then and there is no goodwill. we're exchanging, that's an equal thing, and then boom, we're attacking. Now, we see that Trump does talk about the common sense model in which Putin is referring to, a slogan and all that. That is just Putin kind of sucking up to Trump in a way. So I don't really look at anything like that. But moving forward, when it comes to these talks, like it's weird that I don't think Trump had a full-blown conversation recently with Zelensky before going to Putin. And I think that's the problem. Now, granted, there's probably a lot of things going on in the background, at least I do hope so, in which these conversations are leading to a pro-Ukraine outcome. But it doesn't really feel that way when you have the U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth speaking during the Ramstein meeting on essentially what looks to be all Russian demands. Just to kind of clarify, Russia wants Ukraine to never be a part of NATO. They don't want any support from the United States to essentially be inside of Ukraine. They don't want Ukraine to really have much of an alliance with anyone, not much of a military with anyone. They want to keep all the land that they currently have, plus additional land. So you remember that's what Russia wants. So what did Pete say during his speech? No NATO membership. Not even like we'll push it, no NATO membership. Okay, that's like the first thing that Putin wants. Okay. No return to a pre-2014 Ukraine. Okay, so Russia wants to keep the land, which I do want to add, just to be fair here. Zelensky already said we can do the 2022 border. That's why I'm like kind of confused on why Pete even said that, because I almost feel like he was very uneducated with that. That was something that he should have known to begin with. Then we start getting down to the nitty-gritty. No U.S. troops in Ukraine. And we're not talking about like now, okay? We're talking about if there is a ceasefire and the war is over, no U.S. troops going to Ukraine, which doesn't really make much sense to me, because even under Trump, when he was in office, there were U.S. troops inside of Ukraine to do trainings. We had agreements. We have a partnership with Ukraine. We told them in the 90s, get rid of the nukes, we'll protect you. What's going on here is us negating that and saying that like that never happened. That's what's going on here. And that becomes extremely evident in the next statement, in which it's no more relying on the U.S. for the majority of military funding. Remember, it wasn't NATO that made that agreement with Ukraine. It was the United States. We promised to protect them if they got rid of their nukes, which asks the question that everyone should be asking. Well, if you don't want to support Ukraine and help them, then give them their nukes back, which technically they can't, because if you actually look into it, the agreement is that Ukraine gave up their nukes, but those nukes went to Russia. Give Ukraine nukes. If you don't want to deal anything with it, give them the nukes. That would stop Putin. That would stop Putin. But that's not everything that Pete said during that meeting. He did say a few things extra, such as security guarantees for Ukraine. They have to come from Europe, not from the United States. To me, out of everything that was said, that's probably the worst out of all of them. And I'm not trying to be rude to European countries here. I think Europeans actually understand where I'm coming from on this subject. But the reason why security guarantees from the United States were so important was because of the fact that Putin is scared of the United States. He's not scared of Europe. And so security guarantees from Europe is kind of one of those like, okay, well, how much can they really do? They're kind of small. They're not a powerhouse. Security guarantees from the United States are, oh, now we're done. We can't do this anymore. We can't do this because the United States now backs Ukraine. There's a big difference there. And so for the U.S. not to be behind the security guarantees, I think is a non-starter. Like the border thing is like, all right, well, we can work on that. The no U.S. troops thing, okay, well, I'm sure that other countries already said they're going to do it. That's okay. The NATO membership thing is kind of like, but no security guarantees from the United States is just like I think this war is just going to keep continuing. I think Europe is just going to continue to fund and just keep going, and we'll see what happens. I think that's where this kind of ends. Now, Pete did go on to say that the United States is doing something really good. Now, I could argue that this is something that should have been done a while ago, but that is they're going to be releasing more energy, which will flood the markets everywhere, which would make the Russian fuel a lot cheaper, which means that what? Russia can't make as much money. On top of that, with sanctions and tariffs, let's just say that the price of oil barrel is $100. I don't know what it is. I'm just guessing here. If they drop the prices, or if the U.S. floods the market, that gets to 90. Well, let's just say U.S. oil is 90 and Russian oil is 90. They're the same price. But if you put sanctions on Russia, even if it's $5, let's just say you're 90 and 95, that adds up when you buy hundreds of thousands, if not millions of barrels of oil. And with that pressure, that would then pressure Putin to come to the table. Now, you can make the argument that Putin's already came to the table now. Not really true. It was just an initial phone call. But that is something that I think that we all understand is something that should actually be happening. And the next thing I actually agree with Pete with, and something that Trump has said and something that Zelensky says, is that when it comes to NATO, and countries giving in for their, whether it be any kind of air defense or just defense in general, that needs to be raised to 5%. Right now, it's not a requirement, but it is suggested that every country gives 2% of their GDP. And I have to admit, in the past few years, we've actually seen a lot more countries give that 2%. But since the United States not really giving security guarantees, and a lot of these things are happening, we could all assume, and you have to assume different scenarios, but we have to assume that Russia would just pick back up on this in the next 5 years, within the next 5 years. And Europe, if Russia were to do this to Poland or anything like that, they're not ready. They're not ready at all. And we've seen, NATO generals and other high officials kind of put out this warning that, like, look, if Putin tries to do this, we don't have this together. We don't have it. And so putting that spending at 5%, I think, is necessary, at least temporarily, to build up the fortifications and anything that's needed. Critical infrastructure, build more weapons, all that stuff to make sure they're ready in case Putin does this, which at this moment seems like he's really willing to do it. Pete later goes on to say that the United States is now focusing on their relationship with China rather than their relationship with Europe and Ukraine, which is kind of upsetting when you really think about it, because it feels like that means the United States is turning a blind eye. It almost feels like we're back in 1939 and we see stuff going on in Europe and we're living in our la-la land here in the United States saying, oh yeah, it'll figure it out on its own. And it won't. That's not, history shows that that's not the way it works. You have to be proactive here to stop things from happening down the line. And I fear that if the United States doesn't nip this in the bud now by security guarantees and helping out, that my children in the future will have to go over there and fight. And that's the scary reality. That the option to end this now with a strong U.S. front is just being let go for some strange reason, because we care more about China than we do about Europe. And that's scary. And as Pete says here, that the U.S. relationship will now prioritize empowering Europe to own responsibility for its own security. NATO was created to make sure that world wars will never happen again. And if we're only just empowering, that doesn't do anything. If I empower you to go do something, what does that actually mean? Nothing. You have to do things by showing force and showing what exactly you could be messing with if you do something wrong. But if I empower you, to me, it doesn't make any sense. It just feels like we're just turning a blind eye to a problem because we just don't want to deal with it. And that's the sad part, because that's not peace through strength. That is weakness. That's peace through weakness. And I do not want the United States to be associated with weakness. Because if we do all of this and Russia gets what they want, the U.S. failed. If we do all of this and Russia then invades again, we failed. And I refuse to admit that we live in a failed country where my grandparents, your grandparents, fought to keep our country free. And yet we allow tyrants and dictators to take over lands because they woke up and decided today is the day I want to invade Europe. It's disgusting, and I hope that this right here is the beginning of maybe backlash the U.S. government's going to see from countries around the world and its citizens and go, we made a grave mistake. We need to make sure Ukraine gets everything it needs to make sure that it not only never happens in Ukraine ever again, but to no other NATO or European country. Let me know what you think about this in the comment section below. Please share my videos and follow me for more.